There comes a time in your journey when God pulls you away from the noise, away from the distractions, away from the people you once leaned on. And in that moment, it feels like everything you knew, everything you trusted is slipping through your fingers. You look around and suddenly the crowd is gone. The applause is silent. The familiar voices fade. It's just you and God. That's when the questions start creeping in. Why is this happening? Why does it feel like I'm losing everything? But what if I told you this isn't loss? This isn't abandonment. This is divine separation. This is God setting you apart for something greater. Because there are things He can only do in you when you're alone with Him. See, we live in a world where we are constantly surrounded by people, their opinions, their expectations, their validation. And without realizing it, we begin to shape our lives around those voices. We move when they say move. We stop when they say stop. But when God wants to transform you, when He wants to elevate you, the first thing He does is remove the excess. He pulls you away not to punish you, but to prepare you. Look at Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by luxury, power, and influence. But before God could use him, before he could lead a nation, Moses had to go through the wilderness alone. 40 years in isolation, stripped of title, stripped of identity, until he was ready to hear the voice of God from the burning bush. And when that moment came, he wasn't just a man who had lived in a palace. He was a man who had been shaped by the fire of solitude. Or take Elijah, a prophet who stood boldly against the false prophets of Baal, a man who called down fire from heaven, but before the fire there was the cave. Before the miracle there was a moment of silence, a moment where Elijah found himself alone, wondering if God had abandoned him. But in that silence, in that stillness, came the whisper of God. A whisper that changed everything. God does His deepest work in the moments when we feel most alone. Because that's when our hearts are raw, when our spirits are open, when our ears are finally ready to hear, when there's no one left to run to, no one left to rely on. That's when we realize God was always enough. He was always the source. He was always the foundation. And the things we thought we needed, the people we thought we couldn't live without, they were never meant to be our security in the first place. Some of you are in that season right now. You're looking at your life and it feels like doors are closing, relationships are shifting, familiar things are being stripped away, and you're wondering, God, what are you doing? Why does it feel like I'm all alone? But hear me, God is not punishing you. He is positioning you. He is preparing you for something that requires a deeper level of dependence, a greater level of faith, a sharper level of discernment, and He knows He can't get you there while you're still clinging to things that were never meant to carry you. Think about Jesus. Before the miracles, before the crowds, before the resurrection, there was the wilderness. 40 days alone, no followers, no recognition, just Him and the Father. And in that place, in that solitude, He overcame every temptation, every trial, and walked out of that season in the power of the Spirit. So if God has pulled you into a season of isolation, don't resist it. Don't fight against it. Lean into it, because what feels like separation is actually elevation in disguise. What feels like loneliness is actually God's invitation to know Him deeper, to trust Him fully, to be strengthened in ways you never imagined. And when the time is right, when the work is complete, you won't just step out, you'll rise. You won't just walk back into life as you knew it. You'll step into the next level of your calling, unshaken, unbreakable, and unstoppable. Because God never pulls you away to leave you there. He pulls you away so He can launch you forward. There comes a moment in life when God sets you apart, not because you're forgotten, not because you're rejected, but because you've been chosen. And when you are chosen, you cannot walk the same path as everyone else. You cannot move the way they move, talk the way they talk, or live the way they live. Because the calling on your life demands separation. It doesn't always feel good. Being set apart can feel like rejection, like isolation, like you're being left behind while everyone else moves forward. You watch people around you succeed, build relationships, celebrate victories, and yet here you are walking a different road, alone. You start to wonder, why? Why does my journey look so different? Why does it seem like I have to take the harder path while others get shortcuts? But hear me, this is not punishment. This is God's process. He cannot use someone who blends in. He cannot elevate someone who refuses to be set apart. Every person God has ever used greatly, He first separated. He pulled them away from the crowd, away from the familiar, away from the easy path. Because when you are set apart, you are not called to live at the level of the world. You are called to rise above it. Look at Noah. The entire world was moving in one direction: corruption, wickedness, destruction. But God looked at Noah and said, you are different. You will not follow the world. You will build something greater. And that man, isolated, misunderstood, ridiculed, obeyed God. He built something no one had ever seen before. He worked in obedience when others laughed at him. And when the storm came, when the floods covered the earth, Noah wasn't drowning. He was rising above it all in what God had called him to build. Some of you are in that place right now. You feel the weight of being different. You feel the sting of walking a path that no one else understands. You wonder why you can't just be like everyone else, why you can't just fit in. But let me ask you something. Was Noah meant to fit in with a world that was about to drown? Was he meant to follow people who had no idea what was coming? Or was he meant to listen to God, stand apart, and build something that would save generations? When God sets you apart, it's not to harm you. It's to protect you. It's to prepare you. Because what He is doing in your life cannot be done in the crowd. It cannot be done in compromise. It can only be done in consecration. David understood this. Anointed as king, but still tending sheep, called to greatness, but left in obscurity. His brothers went to battle. His family moved forward, and yet David was left behind. It seemed unfair. But what no one saw was that David was being prepared in the pasture. While others were looking for the throne, he was developing a heart that could carry the weight of it. When the time came, he wasn't just a shepherd, he was a warrior, a king, a man after God's own heart. And what about Jesus? Before he ever performed a miracle, before he ever preached to the masses, before he ever walked on water or raised the dead, he was set apart. He lived differently. He walked in a way that others didn't understand. He fasted when others feasted. He withdrew to pray when others sought the crowd. He moved with purpose, not popularity. And because of that, he carried a power that the world had never seen. So why would it be any different for you? If God has set you apart, if He has pulled you away from the places and people you thought you needed, if He has placed you in a season where you feel different, unusual, alone, it is not for nothing. It is because He is preparing something greater in you. Stop trying to fit into places that God is calling you out of. Stop trying to belong where you were never meant to stay. You are not called to walk like everyone else. You are not called to think like everyone else. You are not called to live like everyone else. You are set apart. And when you embrace that, when you stop fighting it and start walking in it, you will see why God had to separate you. You will see that what He has for you is so much greater than what you were trying to hold on to. Because when you are set apart by God, you are not losing. You are being positioned. Positioned for impact. Position for purpose. Position for something this world cannot take away. There is something about silence that makes most people uncomfortable. We live in a world full of noise, constant movement, endless opinions, the pressure to always be doing something, saying something, proving something. And yet when God truly wants to speak to you, He doesn't compete with the noise. He calls you into the silence. But here's the problem. Many people never hear God because they are afraid of being alone with Him. They don't realize that silence is where clarity is born. Silence is where direction is given. Silence is where God's voice becomes undeniable. Think about it. When everything around you is loud, when people are constantly in your ear, when distractions are pulling you in 100 different directions, how can you possibly hear the still small voice of God? How can you recognize His leading when your mind is filled with the opinions of the world? This is why God will sometimes strip away the noise. He will pull you into a season where He removes the distractions, closes doors you thought would stay open, and silences voices you thought would always be there, not to punish you, but to get your attention. Because when everything else fades, that's when you start to hear what He's been saying all along. Elijah learned this. He had just come from a great victory, standing boldly on Mount Carmel, calling down fire from heaven. But right after that moment of triumph, fear crept in. He ran for his life, found himself alone in a cave, and cried out to God. And God answered, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, not in the wind, but in a whisper. A whisper. Think about that. Why would God, in a moment where Elijah was desperate for direction, choose to speak in a whisper? Because a whisper forces you to lean in. A whisper requires your full attention. A whisper can only be heard when you quiet everything else. Some of you are in that place right now. You've been asking God for direction, for clarity, for answers. And you're waiting for a sign, waiting for something dramatic, waiting for God to shake the heavens and part the seas. But what if He's already speaking? What if He's been whispering, but the noise around you has been too loud? Look at Jesus. Before every major moment in His ministry, what did He do? He withdrew. He stepped away from the crowds. He went to the wilderness. He prayed in solitude, because even He, the Son of God, knew that clarity only comes in communion with the Father. Some of you have been running to people when you should be running to God. You've been looking for answers in all the wrong places. You've been filling your life with so much noise that you can't even recognize the voice of the one who created you. And now God is pulling you into a season where He is saying, be still, be quiet, listen. It's uncomfortable at first. When the noise is gone, when the distractions are stripped away, when you're left alone with your thoughts, it can feel unsettling. But that's where the transformation happens. That's where the healing begins. That's where you start to realize that you never needed the approval, the validation, the constant movement. All you needed was Him. Moses had to go to the mountain alone to hear from God. Paul had to spend years in the wilderness before stepping into his calling. Even John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ, lived in the wilderness before his voice shook the earth. Because every great move of God begins in the silence. Some of you are afraid of this season you're in. Afraid of the quiet, afraid of the unknown, afraid of being alone. But what if this is the season where you finally hear what God has been trying to tell you all along? What if this is the moment where everything becomes clear? Because clarity doesn't come in chaos. It doesn't come in constant movement. It doesn't come in the opinions of others. It comes when you silence everything else and lean into the one who has been speaking all along. And when you finally hear Him, when you finally recognize His voice, you'll realize He was never silent. You were just too distracted to listen. Faith is not proven in comfort. Faith is not developed when everything is easy, when doors swing open effortlessly, when people cheer you on at every step. No, faith is forged in the fire. Faith is built in isolation. Faith is strengthened when everything around you says you should give up, but something inside of you refuses to quit. God will often lead you into a season where it feels like everything familiar is gone, where the things you once relied on no longer work, where the people you once counted on disappear. And in that moment, you are left with only one choice. Will you trust God, or will you fall apart? Look at Abraham. God told him, leave your father's house, leave everything you've ever known, and go to a land I will show you. Not a land that was already prepared, not a city already built, not a future that was clear, just a direction, just a promise. And Abraham had to walk step by step with no map, no plan, only faith. He had to trust that even though he didn't know where he was going, God did. That's what faith is. It's not believing when you can see the whole picture. It's believing when you have nothing but a word from God. It's trusting Him when everything in your flesh tells you to turn back. Some of you are in that place right now. You don't understand why God has allowed certain things to be stripped away. You don't know why the season you're in feels so lonely, so uncertain, so unfamiliar. But hear this. God is building your faith. He is strengthening you in the very place where you feel the weakest. Because if your faith was only strong when everything was going your way, it was never faith to begin with. Look at Joseph. He had a dream, a promise from God that he would be great, that he would lead, that he would be elevated. But before the dream came to pass, there was a pit, there was slavery, there was prison. And for years, it looked like the promise would never come to pass. Every time Joseph thought things were getting better, life knocked him down again. But here's what you have to understand. God wasn't breaking him. God was preparing him. God was making sure that when the promise was fulfilled, Joseph wouldn't just have a position, he would have the character to carry it. That's what many people miss. They want the promise, but they don't want the process. They want the blessing, but they don't want the breaking. They want the elevation, but they don't want the isolation. But the truth is, you cannot carry the weight of your calling without first developing the strength to hold it. And strength is not built in comfort, it is built in struggle. Jesus himself understood this. Before he performed miracles, before he preached to thousands, before he went to the cross, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. 40 days of isolation, 40 days of testing, 40 days of hunger, exhaustion, and spiritual warfare. And why? Because faith that has not been tested cannot be trusted. If Jesus had to endure the wilderness before stepping into his destiny, what makes you think you won't have to endure yours? So if you find yourself in a season where nothing makes sense, where doors seem closed, where you feel forgotten, hold on. Do not despise the process. Do not give up in the middle of the wilderness, because what God is building in you now is preparing you for where he is taking you next. You may not see it now, but there will come a day when you look back and realize that this season, the season that felt like the hardest, the loneliest, the most painful, was the season that made you, the season that built your faith, the season that shaped your destiny. The season that turned you into the person God always intended you to be. Because faith is not proven when everything is easy. It is proven when all you have left is God. And you realize he was more than enough all along. There comes a time when God removes every crutch, every safety net, every fallback plan, and leaves you with nothing but him. Not because he wants you to suffer, not because he wants you to struggle, but because he wants you to know deep in your soul that he alone is your source. He alone is your provider. He alone is your strength. It's easy to say we trust God when everything is in place, when the bank account is full, when the relationships are solid, when the opportunities are flowing. But what happens when all of that is stripped away? What happens when the people you depended on walk away? When the doors you counted on suddenly close? When the comfort you once had is replaced with uncertainty? That's when your faith is tested. That's when you find out if you truly trust God or if you are just trusting in the things he gave you. God has a way of taking us through seasons where he removes everything we thought we needed just to show us that he was all we ever really had. Because as long as you have something else to lean on, you will never fully lean on him. As long as you have a backup plan, you will never fully surrender. And God is after full surrender. He is after a heart that says, even if everything else falls apart, I will still trust you. Even if I have nothing left, I know you are enough. Look at the Israelites. God brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and into the wilderness. And in that place, he took away every system, every source of security they had ever known. No more Pharaoh, no more fields to work, no more food supply to rely on. And why? Because he wanted to teach them something. They didn't need Egypt. They didn't need to depend on human provision. They needed him. So he fed them with manna from heaven. He made water flow from a rock. He led them with a cloud by day and fire by night. Everything they needed came from him alone, and yet some of them still longed for Egypt. Some of them still wanted to go back to the very thing that once enslaved them, and that's just like us. When God starts stripping things away, when he starts removing what we once leaned on, our first instinct is to reach back, to try and grab what he is calling us to release. But you cannot move forward while holding on to the past. You cannot step into God's provision while still longing for what you lost. Some of you are in that place right now. You're looking at your life and it feels like everything is shifting. The people you thought would always be there have disappeared. The opportunities you once counted on have dried up. The things that once gave you comfort no longer satisfy, and you're asking God, why? Why does it feel like I'm losing everything? But hear this. God is not taking things away to hurt you. He is taking things away to free you, to break your dependence on what was never meant to sustain you, to teach you that he alone is enough. Look at Elijah. There was a time when God provided for him through a brook. Water flowed, ravens brought food, everything was taken care of. But then one day the brook dried up, and Elijah could have panicked. He could have doubted God. But what he didn't realize was that the drying up of the brook wasn't the end, it was just a shift. God was about to provide in a new way through a widow in Zarephath. That's what some of you need to understand. Just because one source dries up doesn't mean God has left you. Just because something familiar is gone doesn't mean your provision is gone. It just means God is shifting things. He is moving you into a new place, a new season, a new level of dependence on Him. Look at Jesus hanging on the cross, abandoned, betrayed, left alone. No disciples standing with Him. No miracles to prove His power, just Him and the Father. And in that moment, when everything else was stripped away, his trust in God never wavered because he knew the Father was still in control. That's the place God wants to bring you to. A place where your faith is not in things, not in people, not in circumstances, but in Him alone. Because when everything else is gone, when the crutches are removed, when the distractions are silenced, you will finally see what was true all along. God was always enough. There will come a moment when you realize that the journey God has taken you on was never about the things you lost, never about the people who left, never about the doors that closed. It was always about preparing you for something greater. It was always about shaping you into the person He created you to be. And for that to happen, He had to take you through the process. He had to bring you to a place where you could stand with unshakable confidence and say, God alone is enough. When God calls you, He doesn't just call you to something, He calls you to become someone. And that becoming requires seasons of isolation. It requires moments where you are stripped of everything familiar so that you can be rebuilt into someone who walks with true power, true faith, true authority. That's why He takes you through the wilderness. That's why He removes every crutch. Because He's not interested in making you comfortable. He's interested in making you unstoppable. And when you come out of that process, when you step into what He has been preparing you for, you will look back and realize that every struggle, every lonely night, every moment of uncertainty was necessary. You will realize that what felt like loss was actually gain. What felt like rejection was actually protection. What felt like a season of silence was actually the season where God was speaking the loudest. Look at David. He was anointed to be king, but before he ever wore a crown, he had to go through the wilderness. He had to be chased, hunted, hidden in caves, left alone with nothing but his faith in God. And in that place, when it seemed like everything was against him, God was shaping him, God was strengthening him, God was making sure that when he finally stepped into his calling, he wouldn't just wear the crown, he would have the character to carry it, because elevation without preparation will crush you. Promotion without process will destroy you. That's why God doesn't rush your journey. That's why He doesn't just hand you the promise without taking you through the fire first. Because He knows that if you don't develop the strength to hold what He is giving you, you will not last. That's why you had to go through the pain. That's why certain doors had to close, certain relationships had to end, certain seasons had to shift. It wasn't because God abandoned you. It was because He was protecting what He placed inside of you. He was making sure that when He brings you into the place He has prepared for you, you will be ready. Some of you are standing right on the edge of your breakthrough. You have been through the fire, you have endured the process, and now God is about to open the door. But hear this, when He does, don't look back, don't question whether you are ready. Don't doubt what He has done in you, because everything you went through was not for nothing. Every tear, every prayer, every moment of wondering if you would make it, God was using it all to position you for this moment. Moses couldn't take the Israelites into the promised land until they were ready, until they had been stripped of their slave mentality, until they had learned to trust God fully. And some of you have been in a season where God has been doing the same in you. He has been removing the old mindsets, breaking the chains of your past, teaching you to rely on Him alone. And now the time is coming when He will say, step forward, go where I am leading you, walk into the place I have prepared for you. And when that moment comes, you will realize something: you were never alone. Even in the silence, even in the isolation, even when it felt like no one else understood, God was with you. He was guiding you. He was strengthening you. And now, because you endured, because you refused to give up, because you trusted Him, even when you couldn't see the way forward, you are ready. So stand firm. Hold your head high, because the season of preparation is ending and the season of promise is beginning.